All right. Thank you everyone for joining us for tonight's lecture. As a friendly reminder, this lecture will be recorded. If you do not wish to appear on the recording, just keep those cameras off. And to reduce feedback, we'll keep everyone muted as well. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the chat feature and I will read them out when appropriate, but there will be time for Q&A at the end of the lecture. And with that, I will pass it along to you, Eric.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let me make sure that I share my appropriate screen. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming here tonight. I'm excited to talk with you about my research and something that I care very deeply about. As you probably saw in the primer for this title I'm calling, or the title of this talk I'm calling 100 Years Later, Investigating the Decline of the Neuse River Waterdog to Support Its Recovery. And just for a little bit of background about myself and why I'm talking about the Neuse River Waterdog, I just finished my PhD at NC State back in April of this year, where I spent 6 years studying this really incredible species. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the animal and my experience with it. So I first want to start out though, just what is a Neuse River Waterdog? This is maybe something you've heard of, maybe something you haven't. I find more often than not within the triangle, so amazingly, people haven't heard of it, even though it's this really incredible species that we have local to the area. So let's dive into learning a little bit about what this salamander is. So the Neuse River Waterdog is this large aquatic salamander that is only found in the Neuse and Tar River basins here in eastern North Carolina. And generally speaking, they have this light brown base color with dark black spots in this unique spotting pattern, kind of similar to how you would imagine a fingerprint. They average around 7.5 inches in total length, so actually quite a large salamander, probably larger than what you're most familiar with. But they can actually even get larger than 7.5 inches. I have a colleague of mine that caught one only a few years ago that was nearly a foot long. We think that's about the maximum size they can get. Now, as I alluded to before, they're an aquatic species. And to accommodate this aquatic lifestyle, they have a couple of features that are uniquely adapted to them. They have this laterally flattened tail, they have these reduced limbs, and external gills, which are those red sort of feathery bits on the sides of their head. And research with one of their common relatives called the common mud puppy suggests that about 60% of their oxygen is taken in through these external gills, whereas the remainder is mainly taken in cutaneously or through the skin. They do have some rudimentary lungs, but they're really just used in dire need. They don't actually function super well. Now, one thing I always like to bring up is this body plan is something that we scientists often call being paedomorphic, which is the retention of their juvenile characteristics into adulthood. So this is a body plan, this laterally flattened tail and these reduced limbs, the red gills. This is a body plan that we see very commonly amongst larval salamanders, where adults will migrate to pools or bodies of water in the spring months, deposit eggs, and those eggs hatch out into this larval form. Now, water dogs are part of a select group that never metamorphose and move out onto land. They stay like this for their entire life cycle. So it's a little bit of a more unique strategy. Now, water dogs are, Neuse River water dogs specifically, are part of a larger group which has around 6 or 7 different members. And within North Carolina, we have 3 members of this group. We have the common mud puppy, which is found in the Mississippi drainage, so everywhere from Louisiana all the way up to the Great Lakes. So that includes the western rivers in sort of the mountainous side of North Carolina. We also have the dwarf water dog, which its range I have here described in the blue polygon. They occur everywhere from southwestern Virginia all the way to the Florida Panhandle. And then finally, the third species that we have is, of course, our Neuse River Waterdog. Again, just being restricted to the Neuse and Tar River basins of eastern North Carolina. They occur nowhere else, so they are just endemic to our systems. Now, one fun thing, at least it's fun for me, hopefully it's fun for you, that I really want to highlight here is the origin of the Neuse River Waterdog, or at least as far as we know about it in terms of science. This species was described by Clement S. Brimley, who is one of the co-founders with his brother of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Science, back then called the North Carolina State Museum, I believe. And he described this species exactly 100 years ago this month. He originally described it as a subspecies to that common mud puppy, Nectaris maculosus, that I described before. And then in the 30s, it was elevated to a full species status. But just really, really fun, I think, that this species now to science is 100 years old. So perfect timing for this lecture. So I mentioned before that it's only found in North Carolina, and specifically that it's endemic to these perennial freshwater streams of the Neuse and Tar River basins in North Carolina. And just to orient yourself a little bit, the little yellow star that I have on this map is roughly where Lake Johnson is. So it's within the Neuse River Basin. Now, I want you to pay special attention to some of these other terms that I used being perennial freshwater streams. So like most amphibians, these water dogs have a very low tolerance for saline conditions. So they're not going to be out in the sound or very close to our coastline. They also need to be in streams that are going to maintain flow throughout the entire year. So they're not going to dry down in some of the more extreme drought conditions that we might experience throughout the summer. If you have a stream that's that small that's going to dry down, water dogs aren't going to be there. And then finally, they need to be in flowing water. The common mud puppy is one exception to this group where they can spend time in lakes and ponds, but Neuse River water dogs can't. Even if there's a small beaver impoundment, they're not going to be in that sort of environment. They need that high dissolved oxygen content that only flowing water provides. Um, they are primarily active during the winter months. So actually right around now is when they're becoming active. And I'll talk about that more in a second here. And they're a generalist predator. So they'll eat pretty much anything that they can encounter in their stream environment. Now, generally that's macroinvertebrates, things like stonefly larvae, blackfly larvae, potentially even snails. But there have been documented records of them eating things like baby eels or even the occasional, terrestrial animal that's accidentally fallen into the stream. So, they don't discriminate. Okay, so this time of year, as I mentioned, is when they're becoming more active, and specifically because this is when they're breeding. Um, this is maybe a little bit counterintuitive. You tend to think of reptiles and amphibians as being less active in the winter, but you need to remember that this is, again, an aquatic species. And so their temperatures that they experience are a little bit more buffered to the air temperature. Also, dissolved oxygen content in the water is higher during winter months when water is cold. So it's a lot easier for them to be active this time of year. So that's why they're breeding. Adults breed through the January through March timeframe. And then in the early summer months of May through June, that's when females are going to be selecting nesting locations and laying their clutch of eggs. They'll lay approximately 30 eggs on the underside of a rock or log or some sort of other protective structure on the stream bed. And they'll be anywhere from maybe a dozen to upwards of a couple dozen. Those eggs will develop for approximately a month before hatching out in the June to July timeframe. And when those little baby water dogs hatch out, they're actually even smaller than in this photo that I have here. This photo is an animal that's probably about a year old. When they first come out of the egg, they're only about an inch long. They're very, very small. And it takes them a long time to mature. Individuals will take anywhere from 5 to 7 years to reach sexual maturity. But once they attain that maturity, adults are believed to be fairly long lived. We don't know how long, but based on some research with other related species, we suspect that they can live potentially upwards of 20 or even 30 years in the wild. So this is an example of a species that lays a lot of eggs. Maybe a lot of those eggs and juveniles don't necessarily survive to adulthood, but once they get to adulthood, they probably have high survival and they can live for a really long time. So this population is sustained by these long-lived adults and every now and again having a couple that reach adulthood. Okay, so I just spent a little bit of time talking about water dog natural history and some about their ecology, but now I want to move into, how are they doing? What are their historical trends in population look like? And really, before my work, we had two benchmarks to use. The first, which is the map on the left, was a study conducted by the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in the late 70s and early 80s. Uh, in this study, they surveyed over 300 locations throughout the Neuse and Tar River basins. And this is where we learned essentially everything that I just shared with you about their natural history, how long they live, what sort of habitat they require, what are the things they eat, all of that. Then about 30 years went by when pretty much no one was paying attention to these critters. And between 2011 and 2015, the Wildlife Resources Commission led an interagency effort to resurvey about half of those original museum locations, hoping to just see how are these things doing? We haven't looked in quite a long time. Now, alarmingly, they found about 40% declines in occurrence in the Neuse and about 30% declines in the Tar. A lot of that occurring within this area that I have circled here in the headwaters of the Neuse. And if you're familiar with this area, it might not surprise you that when I overlay developed land cover over these two time periods, the early 80s versus a more contemporary time frame, you can see how the development of the Raleigh-Durham area has dramatically grown. And we do believe this has significantly contributed, at least in part, to some of the declines in occurrence that we've seen of the water dog. So following up that effort led by the Wildlife Resource Commission, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service conducted a species status assessment in 2017, basically trying to understand, okay, what are its threats? How is it doing? Does it need to be protected? And their answer to that question came in 2021, just a couple of years ago, where they said, yes, this animal does warrant federal protection. And it was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. With that, some critical habitat was also designated, areas that we know it occurs that need to be protected. Now, one thing when I'm talking about this being a threatened species that I always like to bring out is, what does threatened actually mean? Sometimes we hear words like threatened or endangered or imperiled. They're somewhat synonymous, but within the legislation of the Endangered Species Act, threatened actually has a very specific meaning. It means any species which is likely to become an endangered species within the foreseeable future throughout all or a significant portion of its range. An endangered species then being one which is likely to become extinct. So you can think of threatened as being sort of the second tier in terms of how concerned we are. We're not really concerned that they're going to go extinct just now, but if we don't change things, if we don't try to improve their populations, they could get to that more critical endangered status in the near future. And then So now that it's listed, we're beginning to develop some recovery planning, and specifically in 2023, we helped the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service draft a recovery plan, which is published and publicly available through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife website. We're still working on the final recovery plan, which will detail exactly what the federal government intends to do to help protect the species. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's take a step back. So I began my research at North Carolina State University in 2018. So coming hot off the heels of this species status assessment where we knew that something was wrong, but before the federal listing. So I came in right in that sweet spot. And my goal as a graduate student at NC State was to expand our understanding of the species' extant distribution. So essentially, where does it still occur? We wanted to know what's causing its decline, and then also what are driving its population dynamics. So things specifically like survival or reproductive rates or where it occurs and how that changes over space and time. Now, as you might imagine, to answer some of these really challenging questions, we needed to collect some new data. Uh, we could use some of the previous data that I shared before, collected by some of my predecessors, but really we needed some more concentrated, high effort data. So we went out and tried to actually detect Neuse River Waterdogs. To do this, we would go to survey locations and set 10 minnow traps. These are these mesh funnel traps that I have an image of here in the top right. We would place these evenly in a 100-meter transect, usually on the upstream side of a bridge, and we would bait them with chicken liver to try to attract the water dogs. Chicken liver might sound gross to you, but they seem to like it quite a lot. And we'd keep it in these plastic bottles that you might be able to see in that top photo. We would then go back and check those traps for 4 consecutive nights, totaling 40 trap nights of effort per location. In addition to trying to capture water dogs, we would also collect information on the local water quality. So we'd collect data on things like temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen, conductivity. We also conducted some rapid habitat assessments where we sort of qualitatively assessed things like the type of substrate on the stream bottom, or the amount of erosion that's occurring on the stream banks, or even the intactness of the riparian buffers. All of these things that we think holistically contribute to the quality of that local environment. And when we were fortunate enough to actually capture water dogs, to detect them, we would collect a variety of data on them as well. So first, we would always measure them. This is, we measured using both SVL, or snout to vent length, as well as TL, or total length. It's pretty common to use this SVL measurement with reptiles and amphibians because they'll commonly be missing portions of their tail. And so if you want to get an sort of accurate representation of how large they are, getting that tip of the tail to tip of the nose measurement may not always be reliable. We would then take some weight measurements of them, as evidenced in this little Tupperware container on a Walmart food scale, very scientific. And then finally, we would always take 2 different methods to identify individuals. So first, we would take a dorsal photograph that's sort of represented in that top photo, again, because they have this unique spotting pattern. We believed that we could use photos of individuals to uniquely identify them over time, and that was true. We were able to do that. We also used this technique, which is increasingly common with amphibian studies, called visible implant elastomer, and this is shown in the bottom left photo. You can think of visible implant elastomer, or VIE, as essentially tattooing the salamander. We use this silicone-based, so non-toxic fluorescent dye, and we have different colors of that. And by placing different colors in different positions on the underside of the body, that can also enable us to uniquely identify animals if we were to recapture them. You may be asking, what's the importance of recapturing individuals? Well, it's important because when we can actually identify individuals over time, we're releasing them every time we catch them. We're then able to understand, roughly how many are there in the population, or what do their movement patterns look like, or how long are they surviving? All of these things that are important to understanding their long-term recovery. So my study that I conducted was between 2018 and 2023, so 6 years. And in that time, we surveyed, our team surveyed 176 unique locations throughout the Neuse and Tar basins. And 2/3 of these we surveyed in multiple years. So lots of effort devoted to sampling locations. We found water dogs at 81, so roughly just under half of the spots that we searched. And in that, we captured over 700 unique water dogs. So feel really good about that effort. Some locations had very few, while other locations had many and were very robust, and which we were excited to see. All right, so what did we learn through all of that effort? As a grad student, that was an immense amount of effort, taking the time to survey all those locations. Well, first of all, we learned that detectability really matters. Now, this may not necessarily be intuitive, but just because you survey a particular location doesn't mean that you know you will actually find the animal you're looking for. A particular site can have lots of water dogs or whatever other species you're looking for, but if the conditions aren't right, you might not catch them, and you might falsely assume that they're not found at that spot. Well, this was something that we really had to grapple with during this study. One of the things that we found that influenced our detection rates was actually the flow of the water. So here I have the same location that we surveyed in February of 2020, and then again in December of 2022. And I have a tree highlighted here in red to help orient yourself a little bit. You can see that in February, there was way more water flowing through that, well, actually overflowing the banks of the channel. Now, interestingly, we found that when conditions were more like the photo on the left, we had a higher probability of detecting water dogs given that they occurred at that site. In fact, we were able to model this relationship where you can see there's a pretty positive trend where as the mean daily discharge, so that's the mean amount of water flowing through the stream per day, as that increases, our detection probability increased pretty dramatically. And we also learned that there's a lot of threats that Neuse River water dogs face throughout their range. Things like trash pollution, invasive species such as this flathead catfish, damming, which especially in the 70s and 80s, that's when we saw a lot of dams built in North Carolina. But then also just effluent runoff, either from pollution or stormwater sources. All of these things influence water dog occurrence. But specifically, we found that sedimentation is a main threat. Now, sedimentation is when you have some disturbance on the landscape, either from industrial construction or maybe you have a lot of impervious surface. Sedimentation could also develop from exposed soil flowing into the stream in the case of agriculture that's maybe taking place close to the stream banks. And when you have all of these upland sources depositing sediment and silt and muck into the stream, that's going then to cause this homogeneous, sort of monolayer of muck and silt on the stream bottom. And this is particularly problematic for species like the Neuse River water dog because as you might remember, I mentioned before, they nest on the underside of cover objects in these interstitial spaces, these nooks and crannies on the stream floor. And so if you have a lot of sediment settling out of the water and depositing on the stream floor, well, that's going to cover up those potential nesting locations. And that's, excuse me, and that's something that we felt was potentially problematic. So we decided to actually test this. And with the data, we found that occupancy increased as your substrate quality at the particular site increased. So that's, as you had coarser, more heterogeneous substrate on the bottom of the stream, the likelihood that water dogs would be there would increase. And then similarly, as the amount of available cover on the stream bottom increased, the probability of that site also supporting recruitment increased. Now, recruitment is sort of just a different way of saying reproduction. So we saw, higher likelihood water dogs were present when the substrate was better, and a higher likelihood that they were also reproducing when there's more available cover. Both of these things potentially influenced by sedimentation. Now, as you've probably guessed, one of the leading causes of sedimentation within our region, within the Raleigh-Durham area, is development. And this photo that I have here is actually active construction from, I believe, 2 years ago on the 540 Beltway extension, which is connecting the Cary area down to Smithfield. Now, as you might imagine, when we have a heavy rainstorm, well, there's now all of this exposed soil that is going to flow off in all of the stormwater. It's going to go into ditches, it's going to go into the stormwater system, and it's eventually going to find its way out into the streams that are nearby. And one thing that we've, again, been able to model with the data that we have available to us is that the extinction probability at a particular location, so specifically the probability that water dogs will be present in 1 year, but then absent in the next, increases in watersheds with more developed land cover. And we believe that's because it's capturing this idea of sedimentation. You have more disturbed land cover in these developed areas that's pushing sediment and erosion into the stream and contributing to local loss of water dogs. Related to that, we've also found that this recruitment idea, so their reproductive potential, is lower in streams that is more flashy and higher in streams that are less flashy. Now, we typically have more flashy streams in systems that are more developed. So if you can imagine, I probably should have put a graph up here, but if you can imagine, well, okay, every time we get a heavy rain, you get an alert on your phone that says, hey, there's a flash flood warning. Well, that's not really supposed to happen within our systems. The reason that happens is because we have a lot of impervious surface within our watersheds, and the water has to go somewhere. And that creates a lot of flash flooding. It creates a lot of erosion, creates a lot of high spikes in the stream and low spikes when there isn't any rain. And so this is really problematic for water dogs. We find that this limits their reproductive potential. Now, we've also discovered that drought may play a role in some of the declines that we've seen as well. So as I'm sure some of you remember, in the 2007 and 2008 timeframe, North Carolina experienced historically bad droughts. You can see here most of North Carolina was under a D4 exceptional drought for a very extended period of time. And the star on this map is up in Granville County in the Tar River. And that is roughly where this photo on the right is representing. Now, even up there, the Tar River should be flowing throughout the entire year. During this drought, the upper headwaters of the Tar River was dried down to just puddles. And since then, we've had a very difficult time locating Neuse River water dogs in these stream segments, probably because they weren't able to tolerate those extreme drought conditions. Now, we've tried to model this a little bit, and we did find that as the intensity of drought experienced in a given year increased, our probability of localized extinction also increased. Maybe not so surprising. And we would especially expect this to be true in smaller streams and more developed streams, places that already have a little bit of intermittent flow in typical drought conditions. But then if you have really intense drought conditions, that's when those streams are going to be imperiled and those water dog populations are going to struggle. Okay, so what all is happening here? I just threw a lot of information at you, but the main hypothesis of my dissertation that I explored and tried to understand and tried to model was this idea that the declines we're seeing are caused by land cover induced sedimentation, which is limiting the water dog's limiting the water dog's recruitment potential. Excuse me. So that's a lot of big words packed into a small phrase. So let's think about this a little bit graphically. Here is that same sort of life cycle diagram that I showed you before. And this is what we see in a typical sort of healthy stream population. But if we add in a lot of development, a lot of construction, sedimentation, erosion, well, that fills in some of those interstitial spaces in the stream floor, which limits the water dog's ability to then lay and successfully recruit eggs. If there's no longer eggs being produced, then you're not going to have juveniles growing up. And if you no longer have juveniles in the population, it's just a matter of time that you're going to end up with these sort of old geriatric populations of Neuse River water dogs that are no longer functionally reproducing, they're no longer viable, they're just present until they eventually die out for other reasons. And one of those reasons could potentially be drought. That's a major stressor. And so here you could probably begin to imagine why water dogs within some of our streams are under such, imperilment. They have a lot of threats that they're facing, and yeah, it's very challenging. Now, I just spent a lot of time talking about Neuse River water dogs, but one thing that I always want to highlight with this research is that the work that I was doing, the work that we're trying to do to conserve and recover Neuse River water dogs doesn't just benefit Neuse River water dogs. These ideas of sedimentation and stream pollution and climate change induced drought, these are things that affect the entirety of the aquatic communities that we have in North Carolina. And especially in our systems in North Carolina, the Neuse and Tar, these are incredibly biodiverse places, places that have creatures that occur nowhere else. I didn't even mention the multiple mussels and fish and crayfish that are only found in these systems. And so one thing that I really loved about this research is that in trying to protect the Neuse River water dog, any sort of management action that we might take will also be protecting all of those other aquatic species. And then, by proxy, it's going to be protecting the watershed, which protects us, with maintaining clean, healthy water throughout our systems. And this work was really only possible with tons and tons and tons of partners throughout the way. This work was funded by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But we had partners in different academic institutions. We had partners with local conservation agencies and local government agencies. We had work with our state park system. We had work with private consultants. And then finally, we had partnerships with some of the major players in science outreach within our community. All of these groups coming together to try to elevate the story of the Neuse River Waterdog and just to help support its recovery and conservation of our systems. Now, you may be asking yourself, what can I do to help this really incredible, very cute, very charismatic salamander? Well, first of all, just spread the word about water dogs. Like I alluded to before earlier in the talk, most people that I encountered within the triangle don't even know that this species exists. You know, this is a big honking salamander that's only found in our rivers, and most people aren't aware that it's there. You can't protect something or care about something if you aren't aware of it. Second, it's huge to reduce erosion on your property by leaving trees and plants along the banks of streams. Too often we see people mowing all the way up to their creek bank, and that does allow access. It looks very nice, but it doesn't help to stabilize the bank. It doesn't help to filter any sort of nutrient runoffs that might be coming off the landscape. Those riparian uh, plant species are critical for maintaining the integrity of the stream. Uh, Speaking of stuff that's happening on the landscape, just minimizing the use of pesticides and herbicides and other chemicals on your property is going to pay huge dividends for water dogs. We don't really know still the impact that some of these things have on things like water dog physiology. That wasn't my specialty, not something that I researched, but certainly these things are going to impact the macroinvertebrate community that water dogs rely on as their prey source. And then finally, just encourage people to not create dams or stack rocks or really do anything that might be restricting flow in some of the streams and creeks within our region. As I mentioned before, these animals require these complex nooks and crannies on the stream bottom, and they require flowing water. And so when you move rocks and other features within the stream channel, that alters the complexity of the stream and just makes it unsuitable for water dogs and many of the other multitude of animals that need that complexity. So I think I'm just about on time. I think I nailed it. Hopefully I inspired some excitement about Neuse River Water Dogs to all of you. And I would be thrilled to take any questions that you might have. I'll leave up my slides here just in case I need to reference anything, go back. But yeah, thank you so much. I love talking about this work, and I'm happy to hear whatever you have for me.
All right. Thanks, Eric. If y'all have any questions for Eric, please feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask them out loud. There's also a raised hand feature you're welcome to utilize if you like. So any questions? I know I was looking at them, and that right now kids are very all about axolotls. And
Yes,
we have this really great like native species that is kind of in that looks like it's arrested in that same life stage like axolotls are. So that's a
absolutely. You are almost prompting me. So let's see. One slide I sometimes include in talks is this one. This is a phylogenetic tree. You could basically think of it as like a family ancestry of salamanders. And here in red, I have Neuse River water dogs highlighted as part of Nectaris. And, as you mentioned, axolotls are a species that a lot of people think about. We often hear a lot of people that know about hellbenders as well.
mm,
And hellbenders actually not even closely related. They're split by somewhere around 170 million years ago. Axolotls are actually part of the mole salamander group. So a little bit more closely related, but still all the way back here, somewhere around 140 million years ago.
oh
So
wow.
you're exactly right that they look very similar almost solely because of that convergent evolution on maintaining that same body plan into adulthood. But you're right. Yeah, I love getting this because it's a way to give people who already have like a touch point another reason to think that water dogs are cool. It's like, oh, this is like our
Yeah.
version of that animal that I already like.
Right. This is our version, our native version of axolotls. I like that. And let's see, Bryn is also sharing that she always shows them the Neuse River water dogs at the museum whenever kids ask her about axolotls. So thanks for sharing that, Bryn. Courtney asked, have any active conservation measures been taken to improve habitat for them in the study areas?
Awesome question. Um, Short answer is not yet, only because, as I mentioned, we're still in the sort of development stages of understanding what we're going to do. Um, um, it was just a couple weeks ago, I had a meeting with some of our partners with Fish and Wildlife Service, again, detailing out what that final recovery plan is going to look like. We have talked with some other members, other agency members, groups like the Army Corps of Engineers, these groups that frequently go and work on bridge projects and stuff to talk about what are some things that they can do in their infrastructure projects that might benefit water dogs or other aquatic species. So I love that question, but the answer is not yet. Hopefully soon, because we're starting to come up with some ideas.
Great. Hayden asked, if I wanted to take my kids to a
Mm.
local place to try to spot a Neuse River water dog, where is a place we're likely to find one?
Mm. So this is a great question. It's also admittedly a little bit of a complicated question. So I'll lead with um, this is a federally protected species under the Endangered Species Act. And so while on one hand, like I want to get people out seeing them, they're incredible, they're amazing. Uh, on the other hand, because they're federally protected, that also means you are legally not allowed to look for them without proper permitting. So you would have to get in touch with a biologist who is running some sort of program that you'd be able to tag along with. Um, that being said, this is one animal that's really amazing and we're really excited about and we want you to be excited about. But the reality is that North Carolina is a hotspot for salamander diversity. And so, regardless of where you look in a stream, you're likely to find some sort of, arguably equally as cool salamander that's not protected, that there's no problem, trying to catch them and look at them and appreciate them. So yeah, sorry, it's a little bit of a roundabout bummer of a question, but that's the nature of the animals that are not doing super well.
Bryn asks, are there any efforts to study them or breed them in a captive setting?
Man, Bryn, you're coming up with great questions. Not yet, but probably soon. So we have some partners at a local aquatic breeding facility, which has just recently been established. They are primarily going to be working with different um, imperiled mussel species, especially that are, again, these threatened and endangered animals, working to breed them in captivity with the purpose of release. But as you might imagine, if you're working with mussels, you're already working with aquatic species that are native to this region. There has been some interest in having a small population of water dogs there to learn how to understand their husbandry in a captive setting so that if we ever get to the point that we're interested or think that reintroductions are possible, we already have that background knowledge of how can we actually do that and scale it up. So hopefully, I've had many conversations about this.
Great, thanks, Eric.
Hmm.
Any other questions? These are all really good, guys.
Yeah. 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 I mean, if you don't have questions, that's fine, but please keep them coming. I've thought about just about every angle of this animal and their recovery, so I love talking about it.
Okay, well, if we don't have any right now, that's fine. You can feel free to email me later at your whenever you come up with them, and I will pass them along to Eric. Make sure that you guys get the answers that you want, or that sorry, that you will get some answers. Might not be the answers you want, but they will be
Mhm.
answers. Thank you again, Eric, for presenting. Thanks everyone for joining us. If you need EE credit, I will be sending a follow-up email later this week with an EE form. I'll also make this recording available online. We have an environmental lecture series YouTube playlist at Lake Johnson, so I'll make sure I send that link along as well. We've got another lecture coming up in January. I don't have a topic yet, but I believe I have a presenter, so just keep an eye out for that, and we'll be sharing that information soon. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.